Thank you, everyone, for joining. And thank you, Chris, for the intro. I'm going to be talking to you today about a concept that I have been developing for the last number of years that I've been calling test orchestration. And it's basically around the better way or a better way that I found in order to put in place everything that is related to manual and automated testing. But let's get into that. First of all, why should you listen to me? And that's a good question. There are many, many speakers here. But, well, a little bit about me. I am a tester. I've been doing this for 24 years. Just to give you an idea, when I started, the cool thing was the Y2K bug. So if you're old enough, a dinosaur like me, then you know what I'm talking about. I've done everything there is to do in testing. I was an intern when I started during college, and I became a lead and a manager and a director of testing. Somewhere along the line, I even had some years being a consultant. I speak in events like this. And as Chris mentioned a number of years ago, I co-founded a company called Practitest, and I'm not going to be talking about that today, where I am the chief solution architect of our product, and I'm also head of quality. And again, I try to be as much as possible involved in the community. So there are a couple of projects that I have been able to start within Practitest, but again, they're free for the community. One of them being the State of Testing Survey and Report that I run with my friend Lalit Kumar. Currently, he's out of Germany. He's the editor of the Time with Testers. And there's also the Online Test Conf, the free conference. We have been doing them online since way before it was cool. And again, you're more than welcome to join. But enough about me, and let's actually start talking about what we came here to talk. So when people think and talk and think about test automation versus manual testing, especially if you're not a tester, especially if maybe you are a tester, but don't really grasp everything about automation, you tend to think about something like this, where you have manual testing that even if you're pretty good at testing, it will be like a thoroughbred racing that it cannot be compared to a Formula One car. And that is what most people have in their head, especially managers. They say, oh, this is like the magic pill. You take it and everything will run smoothly and fast. But if you've been around enough time, you know that this is not the case. And when I try to explain to people, how can we relate automation to manual? Then I try to use this other analogy. And that is that I look at manual testing. And again, regardless if you're talking about scripted, exploratory, any kind of mix, as your soldiers in the field. We're talking about those commando units or those infantry units that are basically doing that fighting that needs to be done hand to hand. Whereas all the automation tools that you have, and we were just listening about a session on load testing, there's obviously functional testing, and you have all different sorts of other automation in place. Even more right now, when we talk about DevOps and testing in production, that is like the heavy duty stuff. But you cannot win a war with only one of those tools. You need to have both infantry division, you need to have commando units, and you need to have the heavy guns and the heavy lifting. And it is the same with testing. It's not about one or the other. It's about how can you use both of them in order to win your war. And this is what we're talking here about. So I want to talk a little bit about, first of all, start by the challenges of managing manual and automated testing. I mean, why is it an issue? Why is it a trivial? And more importantly, maybe we can start by why is it important right now? What has changed? And everything in life, and I'm a very big history buff, everything in life is a very big evolution. There are no such thing as a revolution. It's usually a number of factors converging together that have been evolving over time in order to make those big changes. And we are on that type of conversion place right now, at least I think so. There are a number of factors happening around testing, around automation overall. First of all, we have a lot of changes in the automation adoption, and especially in the automation tools, where we have more and more tools, every one of them being very, very diverse. Because we have so many tools, one of the things that have happened, again, if you're old enough, you remember when one automation tool license would have cost $5,000 or $10,000. Now you can get them extremely cheap, especially if you're talking about SaaS solutions that are very good. They're also pretty easy to use. And above everything else, automation, it's becoming more robust. If, again, I remember back in the day when we were using Windrunner in order to write our scripts, flakiness was not an issue. Flakiness was part of the game. That's why whenever you run a test and it failed, you run it twice or three times before you called it a failed test. Now things are becoming a lot better. So there's a lot of changes in automation tools. There's also quite a lot of changes, as you're obviously aware, in development and testing processes. Starting from, again, 20 years now or more, we have been working with Agile, with shorter cycles. More importantly for quality, the concept of constant stability. We're not waiting to the end in order to have a good build. We actually try to keep it as much as possible. That clever idea that people call about CI, guys, we used to have nightly build, like forever. But right now it's a lot more accepted, where you're all the time testing the system in order to make sure that you're stable. And obviously right now, where we're adding more and more DevOps, that means that your testing is laser focused on the areas that you need to test before the release, because there are a lot of bugs that, simply put, are less expensive to fix them once they appear in production than to find them before we release the product or deploy the product. So there are a lot of changes, not only in the way that we work, but in the philosophy behind the way we work. And the last point, and again, there are many, but the last point that I think is very important at this point is the changes that we have there we go, on players, on the people going around testing. We have, because we're switching to Agile, because we're switching to DevOps, then we have less testers. The proportion between testing and development is going down on the one hand, but testers are actually becoming organic part of the testing team. That means that because we are working hand in hand with developers, that doesn't make us developers. We're still testers, but we are becoming more technical, especially if we're going over to DevOps environments. But it also means that we're getting our developers in our teams to take a more active role in testing. And it doesn't stop with developers. We're seeing a lot of other people taking part on testing roles. And again, I mentioned the state of testing survey that I have been running for the last 8 years. We see more and more organizations reporting that not only testers are taking part of their testing, they're talking about developers, product people, customer success people, customer support people, even salespeople taking one way or another part on the testing role. So a lot of things are changing. And given that we have changes both in tools, process, and players, that means that we're getting more and better automation testing today than we had ever before. And so this is a big change to what is happening. Now, does that mean that we're not going to be doing manual testing? No, we will continue doing manual testing, but we have more automation here. Now, if we are going to be running manual and automation testing together, then, okay, what's the big deal? A test is a test, right? Well, actually, no. When we look and compare a lot of things of manual test versus automation, some people even don't call it testing, they call it scripting. It's because they're very, very different species. What do we mean by that? Well, we could look at the purpose of the testing. When we look at the purpose of manual testing, we're here to evaluate the product. We're here to find the bugs. We're here to cherry pick and find and look for the stuff that shouldn't be there in order to solve it. Whereas when we're working with automation, most times we're going to be trying to maintain that stability. We're trying to see if there are changes in the product and then analyze those changes in order to see if there's a bug. Okay, so it's not the same thing. We're not running the test for the same purpose. It doesn't stop there. The nature of your test is also going to be very different. And I think that the best example is to think about a manual test that it takes us quite a lot to write it. It can take us 5, 6, 7 hours. Sorry, it takes us a little bit to write. It can take us, again, a number of hours, but then we will run it for many, many, many times. And because the manual execution of the test, then a test that might have taken you half an hour to write, you might run it for 2 hours and also run it 3 or 4 times. Whereas a automatic test, a script, it may take us 5 days, 6 days to write it correctly, but then we just run it in a matter of a minute or 2. So it's completely the opposite. Manual tests usually take a lot more to test, to run. Automation will not test. Something that is very important. The results of your manual test depend directly on the tester. If you're a good tester, if it's a good day, if your mind is clear and you're focused on your testing, you will actually find more bugs than in other circumstances. Whereas for automation, the results literally depend on clicking a button, and it doesn't really matter. It's not related to the person clicking that button. Moreover, when we look at the results, manual tests, usually we run them less time. So we have, again, a smaller number of repetitions, whereas automation, we might run it once a day or multiple times a day. I've seen projects where they have thousands of runs for the same test. Usually when we do manual testing, we're going to be distributing the execution along a number of people in the team. Again, for automation, we don't care. It's a framework running it. doesn't need even to be triggered by anyone else. Whereas in manual tests, the interest resides on the bugs, the direct results that we're finding. I already said that for automation, it's usually around benchmarking. Even if you have, again, if you run 500 test cases, and you know that you have 2 or 3 that are failing, but they're failing over time, you don't really care. It's a stable build. Whereas for manual tests, you go one by one and try to understand what's actually not good. So trying to condense all of this, manual testing is going to be a lot about evaluation and discovery, whereas automation is going to be a lot about stability and certification, whether the same tests are going to work correctly on all the different devices. We're talking here about completely different species, as I mentioned. Now, I want to make a small stop right now on that analysis in order also to mention something that I've seen. Again, one of the things that I do because of my job is I get to talk to every month to hundreds of different testing organizations. And one thing that comes again and again and again, especially when you're talking to non-testers, is how do people see the execution or maybe the process in order to create automatic tests. So for most people, they think that how do you get into test automation? It starts by, oh, you know what? Even before we got automation, we did some planning of our test cases. We wrote manual testing. We have been running them for maybe years. But at some point or another, we decide to buy an automation tool. And yeah, the tool will be perfect. So we'll take this test that are run manually. We'll just go ahead and automate them. They will run forever, and we will get magical reports. Okay, so a lot of people, especially management, especially after they have talked to a salesperson from a test framework tool, they think that that is how it works. Well, we all know that that's not really the case. In practice, usually, and again, what happens, it might be different in different organizations, but by far, this is something we see all the time, is that, first of all, you have the organization where you already have some existing projects. You started doing only manual testing. So you have what it's been called a legacy of manual tests. And if you want to make a revolution, if you want to start doing automation, you will start, first of all, by doing a little bit of a manual test cleanup. And at the end of that cleanup, it's not that you're going to be taking them and automating them. You will have an isolated manual test report that it's slim and it's based on what you want to do. Then you start to work on that testing tool, that testing framework that is very everyone likes, and you're pretty sure that it will cover what you're going to be doing. And so you make an automation POC and you think that it works. So you adopt that framework and you get some isolated outputs for your test automation that is completely, again, isolated for your manual test results. But what happens? After a couple of months, you realize that that automation framework was not as good as you wanted to. It's taking a lot of time. You're not updating your test cases. And so that project just drops. Maybe immediately, maybe a year from then, maybe sometime even later than that, you do another automation POC. And you realize that the problem was that you were trying to test everything with one framework. And well, technology and processes and a lot of other constraints will force you in order to have more than one framework. You implement those frameworks and you end up having for each one of those frameworks, again, isolated test reports. So you have one isolated test report for manual testing, one isolated test report for one framework, and another isolated report from the other framework. And so what happens is that if I, as a test manager, need to come and explain to my development manager or to my CTO or CIO or VP R&D or CEO what's going on, there's no way in heaven that I can send them 1, 2, and 3 isolated reports and tell them, hey, everything's written, just go ahead and see it. I end up doing a lot of manual aggregation, a lot of explanations. Maybe sometimes I just go and explain it verbally because it's very hard for those non-testers to make sense of it all. And this is one of those projects. Let's talk about the other challenges that we're going to be having when we need to manage those manual and automated tests together. So first of all, as we already mentioned, these are very different entities. Your automation is going to be deeper, a lot more specific. Your manual tests are a lot more broader, shallower, but you're actually trying to cover more things. Now, even if we look into each one of these type of testing, manual and automated in themselves, we have a lot of different types of tests. So for manual, we may have scripted versus exploratory or regression versus new feature testing. Whereas for automation, it's even worse than that. You have UI, API, performance, unit test, integration test, you name it. Okay, so even if we try to look into each one of them by themselves, we still have quite a lot of variation. So it's, again, very different what we're trying to do. The timelines are completely different, completely wrong. Automated tests will end up running in a matter of minutes. Worst comes to worst, 3 or 4 hours, especially if you're doing parallelization. Manual test, days, weeks, more than that. So how can you try to put those together? One of the biggest problems that we have with manual automation is that usually we're working on them in different frameworks, so no one really knows how to put them together. Everyone is going to be creating their own test cases. There are usually no guidelines. No one really knows what it's running and when. And again, we see them all over the place. And it's very hard, especially among different teams, to reuse and integrate not only the results, but also the tests that we want to run together. So at the end of the day, we end up having again, completely isolated efforts that just frustrate our management because they're saying, hey, we're investing a lot of money, we're investing a lot of time on this, and you're not getting to something that it's simple. You're not giving me that dashboard that salesperson told me that you will have it green, yellow, red, and I will know when to release it. So fact of the matter is that, well, as always, it is our fault as quality professionals. It is our fault as test architects. It is our fault as QA managers, because we should have been looking at this from a different perspective. It's not about, I know what tests I need to run, I will divide them and do some of them manual, some of them automatic, and hope that everything will work out for the best. It needs to be quite a lot more coordinated than that. We need to have an approach that, first of all, will try to look into what are the desired results. What do we want to achieve? What information we want to send? Who do we want to send it to? And then once you have those requirements, you need to look about how can you break it down, how can you scope it, and how can you actually make all of this happening. In a sense, what we need to do is to stop looking at the individual instruments. We need to stop looking at our manual resources, at our outsourcing, at our load testing, our manual automation, any type of automation we have. And we need to start looking at the whole set together. That is why when I started talking with people, it was very simple for me to define this as test orchestration. Because the whole idea is that once you put together and you focus and form the whole process, it should provide value that is bigger than the sum of each of the individual parts. It's like an orchestra. You need to understand what do you want to have, and you need to be someone conducting it, because it won't happen by itself. It's not going to happen by chance. Now, the test orchestration process, it's something that I started playing around with it a little bit when I started to implement it on the tool that we work with, but it ended up getting a life of its own. I created a model, and what I want to do today is just to introduce that model for you. I'm not going to be able to go too deep into it, but I promise I'm working on a paper, and I will share it, obviously, so that everyone can see it. But I think it's enough in order to change that mindset, and that's what I want to do in the last 10 minutes of the session before we actually go into the Q&A part. What is this orchestration process? Well, you know what? It's not rocket science. We're not going to be reinventing the wheel. But I want you to think about what you're doing differently. And I want you to think about it in the next way. First of all, it will not happen by chance. It will not organize itself later on. You need to start by doing some very careful planning. Now, I know what you're thinking. We're working Agile right now. If we're working Agile, that means that we're going to start working a little bit and then optimize it as time goes on. All that is good and fine. But just like when you're working Agile, you still have a planning session when you put together those user stories and you prioritize them, because, again, you cannot start from the end. You need to start from the beginning. You need to do something very similar with your test orchestration process. So first of all, as I mentioned, when you start a new project, or even right now, if you haven't done it, make a stop and try to understand what is the purpose and what is the scope of all the tests that you're doing. Now, it's not as simple as you may think of. If you're working on mobile devices, then your scope will be different than if you're working on a backend solution for a factory, for example. You need to understand, what do people want you to do? Why are you testing? What information do they need to have? If you're working, again, on a DevOps system, then your testing will be completely different than if you're working on a software that you're going to be shipping using CD-ROMs, and you still have some of those. Once you have that purpose, then and you scope it down, then you can start thinking right now, okay, this makes sense to work manually, this makes sense to work automatically, this makes sense to start manually and then to automate it. You can start to agree on the scope that you have in there, and then you can start breaking it down into tasks. And the idea of breaking it down into tasks is to understand upfront how much you're going to be investing. Once you have it broken down into tasks, you can start doing that prioritization, and you can start putting together, if you can, a timeline. If you cannot, at least the order of execution of what you're going to be doing. But you did that. You did point 4 with point 1 already behind you, something that was hopefully agreed upon not only by your team, but also by your stakeholders. So start by understanding what you're doing, and at least by doing some planning around, because the biggest sin that most organizations do, they start to work before understanding where do they want to be headed. And that is going to be bad. Now, once you have that part, you end going into the longest trail, your ongoing coordination. If you haven't heard of the concept of Center of Excellence, it's about time you do. If not, think about that conductor. It can be one person, it can be a group of people, but you need to be able to coordinate what is going on. What do I mean by that? First of all, you need to have a communication and coordination process across teams, especially if you're working on different agile teams. Each one of them will try to work their own way. It might be even worse or better or more interesting, however you want to see it, if each one of those teams is developing a separate product, separate framework, different technologies. Make sure that you have a very good communication, especially a coordination process across the teams that will allow you to share not only data, but also resources. The single most important thing that will end up happening is having a single reporting and visibility framework. You will have multiple technologies, so it's illogical to have one testing framework. You will have multiple ones because you have different technologies in your product. But the reporting framework needs to be unified. Once you ensure that all of the reports are going to one system, and that system is providing one report, then you will have everything closer to being normalized, everything closer to being that dashboard that everyone actually is looking for. And once you have everything together, then you can integrate between the different tools and frameworks, not only your your automation, but also your manual framework. Now, I'm doing a little bit of self-publicity here. And again, sorry for that. There are many tools in there. But one of the things that we're doing in practice is to ensure that if you have automation and manual testing, you can generate that single report. We're not the only ones. Obviously, we're the best ones because I'm doing that. But again, you can look for other alternatives. Don't try to do it in spreadsheets. Don't try to think that, oh, I'm working with Jira. Guys, Jira is a great ticketing system, but it's not even a reporting platform. So try to understand how can you put everything together, because this is going to be very important. Now, once you have those reports, you go over to money time. This is where you're going to be making the difference, because one of the things that you need to understand is that you're not testing for the sake of testing. You're not testing because you like to test, even if you like to test. You're testing and you're getting paid for testing because you want to help your organization make better decisions. Now we're talking about how can we broadcast the value of what we're doing. First thing that you need to understand is that when you're working in multiple teams, the results of your automation will serve at least their purposes, if not more than that. They need to give value to the team running the test. If I'm running right now unit test, then they should help me for the component that I'm running. If I'm running functional test on my component, it should help my component. But you need to look on the larger scale as well. How can we help for the integration of the system? How can we help before we deploy it? Even the tests that I'm creating, how can they help this other team? So always look at that integrated quality dashboard, not only at your local value, but also at the global value as well. Try also to look for business value. Business value is that value that it might not be extremely relevant for your team, but it's going to be relevant for other teams, for the product team, for the sales team, for the customer support team. It might mean talking about other stuff. For example, support wants to know if the bugs that they reported have been fixed. Sales wants to know, when is this new feature going to come out? Product might want to see when can they actually see the feature in order to give feedback. So try to generate business value for all the rest of the different organizations. And also, one of the things that people are usually afraid of, they say, hey, you know what? I'm sending this set of data on this pie chart, on this dashboard. I'm not going to start sending it on other places. That is completely wrong. You need to send even the same data, even the same reports, trying to use multiple channels in order to have better diffusion. I've read a couple of reports that said a single person who's not related to the project will need to see the same data 2 or 3 times in order for that to start sinking in and understanding. The first time, it makes an impression. The second time, you start understanding, but it sinks in on the third time, which is the same thing. And again, it can be dashboards, presentations, emails. Try to use a combination of all of them. And again, this is a high-level framework, And you may want to see how can you bring it into the team. Now, it's important. It's very easy to make mistakes here in all different directions. So one of the things that I want to caution you about is that you need to make sure that even if you have a centralized process, even if you have a center of excellence orchestrating everything that you have in here, it should not be a set of breaks that will stop that innovation and those trials to be run in the individual teams. All the good ideas will not come from the center of excellence. They will come from the individual teams, and the center of excellence needs to understand something good is happening here and spread it out to the other organizations. So make sure that you do that. I want to take something that I learned from my friend Eran Kinsperner from Perfecto Mobile. You need to invest a lot on cleaning up and refactoring, almost as much as you're doing writing test cases. Because if you're one of those organizations that a test once it's written, it stays there, then you're just going to be exploding the amount of tests. You will have a lot of flakiness and a lot of time to run your test cases. You won't be able to make sense of it all. So use as much time as you need in order to clean up and refactor as much as you do it and make it part of your daily tasks. And again, make sure that a huge mistake. A lot of times teams want to do something like this, but they say, hey, you know what? We'll start from the independent testing frameworks, from the independent reporting frameworks, and we'll just try to make sure that everything fits together on the different frameworks. You need to have an integrated testing framework, an integrated reporting framework from the start. You need to make it a priority. It's not a side cost. Just as Jenkins is not a side cost, or CircleCI is not a side cost, just as Jira is not a side cost, you cannot have your testing framework being a side cost. It needs to be part of the tools that you're going to be using in order to succeed. Now, we're just about going into questions. So I just want to wrap this up with the following points. First of all, from what I've seen, from what a lot of people are talking right now, it used to be the case that we want to work with one integrated platform. We want to work with one suite of components from only one vendor because it's more stable. Technology is driving us to actually spread everything out and work with best of breed approach. And that's okay because a lot of those vendors are trying to integrate their systems together. Don't be afraid to look for a best of breed solution in this case. The key to this is not to wait for visibility towards the end. It should be transparency and visibility throughout the whole process. That's what's going to help you in order to have a healthy process and results. And make sure that you're aligned from the get-go on those business values. As I said, don't start by testing and then try to figure out what information you want to provide, what value you want to provide. Make sure that you do that homework before, during, and after, because those business company values will be shifting and changing as your company changes. And that's all good and fine. We're working agile. We're embracing change instead of running away from it. So this is the test orchestration framework. And again, hopefully it will help you to work a little bit better, especially when you have the challenge of integrating all of those results. And Chris, I think that I'm even on time. I'm surprised.
That's amazing. Nicely done. Yeah, Joel, thank you very much for that talk. I certainly appreciated it. And I think the highlight for me, my favorite line was invest as much time in cleaning and refactoring tests as in writing them. It reminds me of someone who buys a luxury car and then fails to budget for the expensive oil changes that they're going to have to subject the car to. We have a question in the chat. Wow. Anyone else with questions, feel free to add some. Someone asks, what are the tools recommended for reporting?
Okay. I don't like doing this. Try to look for, again, any ALM solution, any test management solution. You can use mine if you want. But one that is actually looking at unifying automation and manual. I think that one of the biggest issues for many of the older tools is that they put a lot of efforts on the manual testing and maybe one integration or two, whereas today it needs to be a lot more open than that. So any ALM solution should work. I've seen some people who have like scattered ALM solutions and frameworks, and then they use something like Tableau in order to unify reports. If you're willing to invest the time, that might work. But there's some very good and not very expensive QA ALM solution test management tools out there. So just look for one.
Any other questions from the chat, or feel free to just jump on the mic.
Go ahead, hit the speaker.
Otherwise, I'm going to ask questions if you folks don't have questions.
Oh God, please no, Chris.
All right, you're forcing me to do it. Joel, you talked about how you survey a lot of companies every year about how they do QA. Are you seeing any trends around QA departments going away or getting folded into dev teams?
You know what? Yes and no. I really invite you to go and check the state of testing report. But one of the things that we saw is that there's no middle ground. A lot of organizations, especially the smallest ones, are actually integrating that testing, are disintegrating the test department and making them part of the agile teams. But if you go to the large organizations, usually banking, insurance, all the large stuff, a little bit of old school, they're still very much put on working with independent testing teams. And they have so many testers that if I was to look at the market, I'm not sure if it's going to be 50-50 or 30% still working on unified teams, but it's not really going away. And it's not only because people are sticking to waterfall. For a long time, organizations still had waterfall projects. It was 50% organizations. Right now, are about 32% of organizations report that they have some projects still running on waterfall. Even those teams working agile, they're managing to work agile while still segregating between the teams. I'm not sure how they do it, but at least that's what they're reporting.
Thank you. Question from the chat. Can you recommend any resources to learn about manual testing?
I was asked that before, and there are the trivial ones. There are a lot of certifications out there. I'm part of the AST, so you can go to, again, to all the BBST courses in there. But I wouldn't take away from even the ISTQB courses. It's not about certification. It's only about learning. And their syllabus is actually pretty good. And again, I haven't read it in a while, but it used to be pretty good on that. I've seen some courses on Udemy as well. And there are many communities right now that are providing testing course and information for free. You can go into Facebook and look for that. You can go into Gmail and look for that. Now, that's about resources. Today, if you want to learn to test, I think that there's a very clear path. There are so many crowdsourcing organizations out there that will take you to work. They will give you some training. They will even pay you. And I'm not saying that you should work for crowdsourcing organizations all your life. You can if it works for you. But it's a very good stepping stone into testing because they will give you experience. They will allow you to get some bearings on testing, and then you can jump to being a tester on another organization. So I would look also for those sources.
Thank you. Any more questions from the audience? So follow-up, can you name one organization that will teach me?
Oh, God. Many. There's Testlio, there's Applause. There's, again, look for test crowdsourcing. I think that should give you a very good heads up.
Another question. I'm not sure I follow this one. What's the percentage of cases where the test is embedded?
Can you clarify embedded where?
Yeah, whoever posted Angelo, could you say a little more about that?
Yes, thanks, Chris. I was trying to distinguish between whether a test function, if that's what it's still called, is embedded with a group of developers, or there's a separate test team of maybe, I don't know, N people that do the so-called test, and they just sort of ping pong it back and forth to the development team. Did I explain?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I have exact numbers. And this is what I was saying before. I would guess that it's growing. You have more and more organizations that are spreading out their testers into development teams. If it's 50% or 60% organizations, I'm not really sure right now, but it's growing. That is the current trend. What I do try to say is that you shouldn't be afraid if your organization is not switching over, because there's still quite a lot of organizations where you do have what is called isolated testing teams or specified testing teams.
Angelo, did that cover your question?
Yes, thanks. I appreciate that. You're gracious.
I love the question from Swapna. Can orchestration be used to migrate large-scale projects? Let me put that differently. Can orchestration be put on large projects? And I think that in larger projects, orchestration actually looks better. It's just like with musical instruments. And again, I have my guitar here if you're really interested. But if you have 3 tools, 3 instruments playing together, it's not the same as if you have 50 or 100 instruments working together. And I've seen the orchestration approach being used in 3 agile teams working together. I've seen it in a project that I've been following up. They have about 12 or 14 agile teams working in about 10 or 15 products that integrate. That is where this shines, because at that scale, that is where, if you don't have the orchestration project, you have a gazillion tests that are not connected and everyone is reinventing the wheel on their own. Whereas here, they're using those materials. And it starts from the reporting. If I know that I have results on this component, I will go and ask, how did you get those results? And I will use those test cases in there. Whether it can be work for migration of large-scale projects, the challenge here might be the migration, because if you have a lot of legacy tests that are not orchestrated, then you might not get the time that you need in order to put this process in place. So it's a tricky question. It really depends on if you're going to be having time to make it right. Now, even if you don't get that time allocated up front, I would still try to put some time for planning and a little bit of coordination, even if you're not able to migrate to a single framework. I think that should still give you some value.
We've got Joel for 1 more minute. Any other questions from anyone?
Yeah, I'm going to finish my coffee.
Joel, I've got a question for you. The testing pyramid that we've seen a million times in this conference and in our jobs generally, do you think how does manual testing fit into that pyramid? Is it just part of those different layers, or is it totally separate from the pyramid?
It will depend more and more on your organization. And as of late, I think that it depends more and more on your methodology and your infrastructure. And this is where I'm trying to make people understand, what does it mean to work DevOps? And I'm going to be using DevOps here as an example. If you remember those times 20 years ago when we used to ship out CD-ROMs to our customers, we had to test everything up front, because literally the cost of a bug escaping on that CD-ROM could have been hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars. I literally released a CD-ROM with a virus in it, and I remember how much of a headache that was. So we needed to find all the bugs related, regardless if they're big or small, before production. So we needed to have a lot of testing, and a big part of that was manual. Today, we're working DevOps. Upfront, I can tell you that testing should be a lot more risk analysis, because there are many, many bugs that it's cheaper for us to not test for them. And if they were to occur in production, there's a big if there, then it will be more cost effective to fix them in production. In this case, then we're going to be doing a lot less manual testing. It will be very surgical analysis of what we need to do, but only because we're building everything on those test automation frameworks and that testing in production monitoring that is going to be happening there. So I think that pyramid, I'm not sure if it was ever completely, again, a triangular pyramid. I think that it was more of a blob. Right now, I think that it might become an inverted pyramid, because we're going to be basing a lot of the testing on the stuff that we can let go to happen in production, whereas we have about a day and a half to test a user story right now, and I'm being large here. So the amount of manual tests we can do is relatively small.
Thanks very much. Appreciate the talk, Joel. Appreciate all the questions.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you everyone for being here. Nice talking to everyone.